like all the old-timers, I haven't changed my vision at all. So if you ask Doug Engelbart or Ken Iverson what they're doing, well, they're doing the same thing they were doing 50 years ago or 45, and so am I. And there's one explanation for this, which I only heard recently. Early adopters never switch. And so those ideas which we adopted at the very beginning seem to us the shining stars of guidance that everyone else is ignoring so deliriously. Now, I'm going to concentrate on text systems because they're of a special interest to me, and they seem to me especially important. You see, I was going to be a filmmaker, and then I took a course in computers. I said, oh, I've got to do this thing for a couple of years. And alas, many films were not made because of this. And it's been one political fight after another. I was surprised to find that the best description, one of the best descriptions of my problems is in Tim Berners-Lee's book, Weaving the Web, where he says on something like page 5 of the preface that I couldn't get backing, which is exactly true. Because I was always a hothead. Other people would try to explain what they were doing in terms of the interests and agendas of those they were addressing. Whereas with a much more Thomas Paine-like position, I said, look, we're not going to have printed paper anymore, so we've got to design a world in which everything we now do on paper is better done on screens. And they say, what? So I would explain how a copyright system and a document system and also could all be put on computer screens. Of course, there weren't any computer screens yet, except at NORAD and in air traffic control centers, but that didn't matter. They were coming. The Moore's Law was in effect, and hey, screens are cheap. TV prices had gone down. And so I couldn't understand. So I would give this whole rap all during the 60s, I would say the whole thing. And there'll be automatic royalty to every author because the copyright issue was outstandingly, that and version control had to be built in from the very beginning. And because I had my own copyright certificates from college, I knew perfectly well that the copyright system was not going to go away, unlike many techies. So when I took this first course in computers, I said, well, holy smoke. Obviously, the documents of the future should be this way. How should they be? Well, for one thing, we want every quotation connected to its source. What could be more obvious? And we want to be able to overlay the whole to represent any possible links. Not all possible links, because that would be infinite and impossible, but to represent any possible links that people would want to represent. So I would explain this all during the 60s, and there'd be a long pause, and almost invariably the hearer would say, is it like a tape? And this would just gobsmack me every time. How could people be so dense? You see, I had one of the first tape recorders that was sold. I had made films. Filmmakers deal with technicalities across the board, okay? It is simply assumed that you can learn technicalities. I had my own American Cinematographer Handbook when I was 15. And all these technicalities are simply layered effects. What is computer graphics but layered effects? The same as making traveling matte movies in the 50s. When I was in high school, a movie came out called When Worlds Collide, which I take as iconic. And in fact, it foresaw the possible menace of being hit by a rogue planet long before we started to actually worry about these things. But there was a great shot where Times Square was flooded by a vast tidal wave. Well, the way you did that was you built a miniature Times Square. You let go of buckets and buckets of water. Times Square has to be black. You have to speed up the camera because you want to dilate the time correctly. And then you have to make a traveling matte, which is the outline of each droplet of water or each wave of the water as it sloshes around these buildings. Then you double print this matte against the picture of a real photograph of Times Square. And you double print the inverse of that matte against the picture of the waves. And you get, presto, as it were, you get the sloshing of the waves. So this is the kind of thing movie makers were dealing with every day. So the idea of computer graphics, which simply means that a list of things ought to be put on the screen, is going to be read automatically by a computer. What's complicated about that? So the issues were not technical. Anyone who is caught by the technicalities snagged by the technicalities and loses sight of the big picture is lost. And so I decided in 1960, at the ripe old age of 22, that it was my job to design the computer documents of the future, because if I didn't, the techies would screw it up. And guess what? That is exactly what has happened. So instead, what did they do? We'll get to that. There were basically three threads, three document threads. Can I write on this? No. That's what I call affordance, right? The racket, yeah. Rise. So, okay. But how obvious it is, since this is where the rack is, that this is what you're going to write on. Oh, yeah. Well, okay, I'll just do it right here. So there were essentially three points of view. There was NLS, Doug Engelbart's online system, where the emphasis was on collaboration and multiple use of the same content, and being able, when two people talked on the phone, they could look at the same screen at the same time and have two mouse bugs, he called them, two mouse cursors, pointing at the same document. Then there was Project Xanadu, which was myself, and I didn't register it as a trademark till, I don't know. But anyway, Project Xanadu, where the emphasis was on disagreement. Because what is literature about? Literature, the world over, is about disagreement and keeping track of all the disagreements. Okay? But also publication, royalty, and following quotations. Then there was a nice man named Jonathan Siebold. He called me up around 1965, I think. Said, I want you to come down to see our setup. He had a typesetting establishment in New Jersey. He was a Quaker who had functioned as a mediator in labor management disputes, and because of his great-heartedness and his Quakerdom, he was able to forge agreement where none seemed possible. And it was thus, through these labor management disputes, that he got into the printing and publication industry. Having thus gotten into the printing and publication industry, he noticed that typesetting was a problem, and everything had to be constantly retypeset. If you were going to put out another Bible, you would have to retypeset it. So he then visited some printing establishment in Florida and had the great epiphany around 1965. You could typeset by computer. And so he spent the rest of his career first on typesetting and then as a consultant. So that's the Siebold typeset image. So these were essentially the three things on the table in the early 60s, I'd say, looking at history in hindsight, as we always do. And then along comes Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, which they set up as far as possible from Xerox corporate headquarters in New York. And this was headed by Bob Taylor, who had headed the DARPA of that time and done a great deal to fund such things as the beginnings of the ARPANET, which became the internet. He had also funded Doug Engelbart. And for Xerox, he wanted to create the Office of the Future, Documents of the Future, whatever. He wasn't exactly an imaginative guy, but he knew what he wanted. He would know it when he saw it. So he had one team at PARC that were from Doug's lab, and they replicated NLS, and another team from PARC, another team not from PARC, which started looking at Siebold's type stuff, say, this is interesting. And they were, of course, building all their own little machines with screens. Oh, God, how we envied them. We would go to conferences, and Alan Kay would get up and say, oh, yes, at PARC, we all have these computers with screens. And I'm like, God, because we were dealing with punch cards or whatever. And then came Chuck Simoni, and he said, well, he started something called the Bravo Project, which made all these nice-looking fonts on the screen. And then John Warnock, up spake John Warnock, and he created the Interpress package, which made a common structure for printing between the different printers that were being served up by and at and for Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. So what image prevailed? Siebold. Typesetting took over. And the computer, as defined at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, they defined the computer. They redefined the computer. They dumbed it down, not just for the man in the street, as Alan Kay was telling us, but they dumbed it down for Xerox upper management. And so they said, this is a computer. It has a desktop, it has a clipboard, blah, blah, blah. And so this reduced notion of the computer was then sold to the public, first by Steve Jobs, called the Macintosh, and then by Bill Gates, called Windows. But incorporated into this was a view that a document is a simulation of paper. That's right. They've taken this incredible instrument, the programmable computer, the general purpose, the all-purpose machine, as von Neumann called it, and they have dumbed it down to simulate paper. That, to me, is like tearing the wings off a 747 and running it on the highway as a bus. That is, to me, so it's okay. So, so this was the image, and the slogan they developed. Siebold had gotten it from the television. The slogan was, "What you see is what you get," and that was actually from a comedian named Flip Wilson, who would dress up as a woman called Geraldine and say, "What you see is what you get." And then Siebold saw this, and he introduced the slogan, I believe, to Xerox PARC, where they abbreviated it WYSIWYG, and that's where we got it. So we have this notion that the computer screen is merely a preview of this font stuff, losing intercommunication, losing all the things you really want for documents. And so that if I seem edgy or angry sometimes, it's because of the Xerox PARC dumbed down. Now, the thing to me which most characterizes the Xerox PARC dumbed down, or the PUI, the PARC user interface. Other people call it the GUI, the modern GUI. But since there would be 1,000 other graphical user interfaces possible, I think that's a very inappropriate term. Call it the PARC user interface, or PUI. So the point is, the dumbed down, the worst part of it is the so-called clipboard. Now, a clipboard on the computer only holds one object, and what you put on it destroys the previous contents. Neither of these properties are shared with the physical clipboard. But in every other respect, the clipboard on the computer resembles a physical clipboard, except there aren't any other respects. So they've used this word as a propagandistic device to justify this abominable hidey hole where you cannot see the contents, and which is used for transferring one object at a time, which means if the phone rings, you forget it and it's gone forever. Happens to me once a week. And I'm sure if it happens to me once a week, it happens to everybody else once a month or so. And that means a vast number of valuable things lost to the human race because Xerox PARC would not put in a stack, at least. But what's worse, they changed the meaning of the words cut and paste. When I was learning to write about the age of 15, write in big pieces, I was taught that the principal activity in writing is rewriting, because you never get it right the first time. Very few of us. And that means you cut it and paste it. What does that mean? You take your original manuscript and you physically cut it into pieces which you put around the tabletop. Tolstoy did this. My first job later on, I was a copy boy at the New York Times, and my first task at 9 a.m. every morning was to fill the pots of paste. I would scrape the old dried stuff out and put in this gleaming, luminescent goo and put them around on the city desk and the foreign desk and whatever. And then when somebody would type a story, cut it up, repaste it, yell copy, and I'd come and get it and put it in the pneumatic tube up to typeset. So cut and paste was a venerable tradition. Then at Xerox PARC, they had this abominable hidey hole, which they called the clipboard. And what did they call its operations? They called them cut and paste. I've long said that whoever came up with that change of meaning should be hanged, but then both Jeff Rulison and Larry Tesler tried to take credit for it. So they're both friends of mine. So I said, okay, we won't hang him. But the point is that the Macintosh came out in 1984. Now, who said that if you change the meaning of words, people will forget? George Orwell. 1984 is when they changed the meaning of cut and paste, and people have forgotten, and so nobody knows how to write. Because the only way to rearrange a big project is the traditional cut and paste project, a method that I've described, which I call deep rearrangement. Because no one knows what I'm talking about if I say cut and paste the old way. But that's the point. That to me is the worst thing that Xerox PARC did. Okay, sorry, I don't want to get off on a rant or anything. Let's get to other issues. So today I want to talk about alternative structures. See, the tradition of hierarchy since Aristotle has so grabbed the computer field that everything is hierarchical. Why? I've heard people say structure meaning hierarchy. Well, excuse me, but there are many structures that are not hierarchical. So what is the correct representation of structure? Well, I would say it's this. Sorry. Just made this. I keep making these illustrations, then mislaying them when disks crash. I think this is it. Okay. Parallel cross connection. So you have things which are side by side with particular connections between them. These are the relations of documents, of people's lives, the relations of ideas, of fields, of historical causation, of physical systems of the body, the neural system, the digestive system, the skeletal system, the muscular system. They interpenetrate. It's not that one is above the other. You have to have them all, and they all have to work, and they all have to be connected, and they're connected. The simplest representation is this. What does a medical student have to learn? Thousands of these particular connections. The head bone connected to the neck bone, the muscular insertion for this muscle cuts in here, etc., etc. And all of these cross connections have to be known. When you are writing a comment, this is a comment you're writing, on a document or on several documents, you are referring to their different parts. That's parallel cross connection. Let's take a very specific example, which I culled from Wikipedia only the other day, which is, right. Oh, we're opening, so I forget what browser we're opening. But the documents have intrinsic parallelisms. And look, I always walk one about now. Bessie Smith said she would walk one, but that meant so entranced by the music, he would rise out of his seat and come to the stage. When I walk one, he goes out the door. Here is the Nicene Creed. When the Emperor Constantine won a battle under the banner of Jesus Christ, he said, okay, Rome is going to be Christian. What does that mean? So they held a council to decide what Christianity meant, and this is what they came up with. And which essentially made a lot of people into heretics. Christianity, prior to that, was much more like New Age Christianity in California, with 100 flowers blooming, feminism, and so on. But then this is what they reduced it to. And then 50 years later, they held another council where they had to clarify a few issues which seemed important at the time. Now, what I'm showing you here is the parallelism within, well, is it two documents or one? I don't care. Because document boundaries are arbitrary, but the connections of content are what count. So here is Nicene Creed A and Nicene Creed B, and these are the corresponding parts. The correspondence and sideways interconnection of documents needs to be fundamentally in the structure of the document mechanism, and not simply as a little table which is inside a single page. Let me give you a better example, or a deeper example, which is a wonderful novel by, where is it? Thank you. Okay. The novel Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. Now the novel Pale Fire is very amusing because it has two parts. A beautiful poem by the poet John Shade, who doesn't exist because he's Nabokov, and outrageous, stupid, asinine comments on this poem by a literary critic named Charles Kinbote, also Nabokov. So he has defiled his own magnificent poem in this novel, and it's a parallel structure. So it is intrinsic that this is comment on that. Now, you can read the poem without the comments, but you can't read the comments without the poem. So this shows how fundamental are the relationships of parallelism among documents. So this is one document. No one can question that Pale Fire is a single document. So how to manage cross-connections among pages and document structures, this is the question. This is one of the key questions. Okay, so I would like to generalize this then to my picture of the structure of the universe. And that's this. Cross-connection, parallel cross-connection, is the model of structure for everything. Now, for example, you can represent, where is it? You can represent documents, and you can have it as a generalization of data structure. So I'm going to try to explain both of those. You can also represent hierarchy in it. You can represent hierarchy in parallel cross-connection far better than you can represent parallel cross-connection in hierarchy. And this is why I hate XML. Because we want a representation that truly handles the most important cases. Okay? So let's jump right away to the present structure of Xanadu software. Where'd it go? That's very odd. I fired it up and it's gone. This will take a second. Oh, it's on this machine. How do I switch? Good enough. Thank you. All right. Here we are. Okay, so here we have parallel cross-connection of pages within a single 11-page hypertext. There are 9 pages in the background, and here's 2 more pages in the foreground. So just to move back and give you a nice sense of the 3D. Isn't it strange that teenagers the world over have this magnificent OpenGL-based graphics card stuff for their games, and people who are doing important things like document work are stuck with Microsoft Word? I mean, my God. In any case, this is going to be a product real soon now, but here we have a demo. This is Xanadu Space, and it has 2 forms of connections, transclusions and links. Now, I wouldn't need to talk about those. But here you see we can fly through the links, and we can also turn to see how far they go. So flying through the links is a rather nice experience. You can't do that on any other system I know of. So the gray ones are the links, and the pink ones are the transclusions. Now, what is the difference? A link is a connection between things which are different. A transclusion is a connection between things which are the same. Now, I told you that one of my first concerns when I got into the electronic document biz back in 1960 was how to connect each quotation to its source. To everybody else in the industry, a document is a box of Scrabble tiles. Whereas I say a document has deep structure which must be correctly represented. And the representation and attachment, an umbilical from every quotation to its origin, seems to me absolutely the first thing you would want. Now, we've generalized this and simplified it to the mechanism we call transclusion, the inclusion of content, the recognizable inclusion of content across a document or page boundary. So here we have the same phrase, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, which is from, as we see on the right, the Genesis of the King James Version. Now, notice what I just did. This was the current page, and I now make this the current page, which shows the origin. We could have an arrow there showing that's the origin. It's among many things we don't have. But the main point of this is that by giving you 2 pages in the foreground, it's not merely for effect, but it's so that you can see each specific connection one at a time. So you can step through you can have thousands of connections overlaid. I mean, one of the horrors of HTML is that you can't have overlay of the end sets. Now, I'll tell you the story of the origin of today's hypertext as I see it later. Wendy and I notwithstanding. Okay, so so let me step down through. Here's a transclusion, here's another nice transclusion. Adam and Lilith immediately began to fight. Who here has heard of Lilith? Yes, one hand, okay. So most people know about Adam and Eve, but Adam and Lilith is a minority variant that was around until Constantine, I believe. And so that Lilith, according to this story, was the first woman, but they couldn't get along, so she flew away. Okay, so now we step down to the next connection, which is this link here. Few educated people today accept the 6-day Adam and Eve account. And we go down to this one, the biblical account of the flood, for instance, the King James Version. And now here's the Babylonian account of the flood, where God speaks not to Noah saying to build an ark, but rather says to Utanipishtim, you go and build an ark. Utanipishtim, and so he did. And it has everything down to the letting loose of the bird at the end. So probably the Hebrews, you see, the three attitudes toward documents, as far as I can tell, in the ancient world were the Babylonian attitude, which is the government controls all documents, the Hebrew attitude of the world, which is that the priests control all documents, and the Greek attitude, which is nobody controls all documents. And guess what? All those points of view are still with us today, aren't they? So anyway, so the Hebrews started, originally writing began as a way of keeping track of what was inside merchants' containers. And then people said, hey, we can use this for other stuff. And the Hebrews started using it for their begats. And because the story of the flood was lying around, they threw that in and a whole lot of other stuff. And look where we are now. So anyway, so here are the various connections of this particular hypertext, which I merely created so you could see the mechanisms. Notice the cool flying back and forth of the different pages. We call this swarfing, which is a combination of swooping and morphing. These are, of course, the same concept where you're changing the coordinates. Swooping is the external coordinates of a page, and morphing is the internal coordinates of something. And if you're using the same mechanism for both, you might as well have the same word for both. So, and you can, of course, go to the companion page and make that the current page and go up to another connection and follow that. So you can essentially ping pong among all the connections of a document plex with this mechanism. That's all there is. It's taken me 47 years to simplify it to this, and we hope it's a product real soon now. The document structure inside has nothing to do with HTML. I'll show you. Where are we here? Right. EDLs. So, oh, I have to use a WordPad, I suppose. Where the heck are programs here? Oh, all programs. Accessories. Notepad, that's it. Okay, so EDL, and in Hollywood the term EDL means edit decision list. When you shoot a bunch of videos, every frame has a number, right? You have reel 7, frame 4023. So the editing process is deciding what sequence of shots to use. And so I don't know if any of you have edited video or movies, but it is an agonizing process. The better you are, the harder it is, because the number of choices approaches infinity. And you have to make a lot of simplifying decisions, and the best editors agonize, and the fastest editors make very simplifying decisions. So what you end up with today is an EDL, an edit decision list, because you have been working with reduced resolution footage. And now this goes to the equipment which copies every shot in full resolution into the final version. And of course, you also have EDLs for the sound, which are more complex because you're overlaying different tracks. But we're using the EDL concept. Let's see if it copies here. Yeah, we're using the EDL concept for documents. So each document is each page is represented by a series of entries. Each of these specifies a string to be brought from a particular source, which in this case is called test permascroll because it was simplest to bring them from one place. And then they're concatenated into the pages you see. If we had formatting here, like paragraphing and fonts, those two would be specifics. Pardon me. No, sorry. The formatting is separately applied. But that is essentially how you get the individual content list of a particular page. And overlaying that are the flinks, which are not called, but we're now calling them flinks, Wendy. I knew you liked that term. In this version, they're called clinks. So a clink has a type and a source string and a destination string. And so the flink is independent of the particular instantiation of the content. Flinks will be first-class objects independently publishable. So if you wish to publish a comment on an existing document, you will be able to put out the flink that says, here, go and get my content and go and get this page and attach them. Now, we aren't up to that right yet. Being able to bring HTML pages into this is the very next step, but first we have to get out this editor. So that is Xanadu structure. Xanadu structure then consists of, and you can read it, the structure is further detailed at transliterature.org, but that version isn't quite up to date on our present implementation. And it's, as you see, very simple. Lists of content and flinks to be overlaid on the content itself by the absolute addresses of the content. Individual content addresses within the page are not used. What about transclusions? They are found by the reader. If two addresses are the same, if two source addresses on two different EDLs are the same, then they are deemed to be transclusive. Okay, that's the document structure. I can go on for 20 more minutes. I'm going to, that's very simple. I'm going to challenge you more with the next one. 10 minutes, okay. So, well, let me take any, let's all breathe deeply, and I'll take any questions for now and go on from then. Yeah? Pardon?
You're handling versioning documents, but I don't see a version in the addressing fields.
No, it's not implemented yet. The versioning system we're using was actually implemented in Japan by my student Kenichi Unnai, beautifully implemented with a Perl server and an Emacs client. And what it did, okay, you have to put your fingernails under this to get it up. Okay. I'm warming up here. This is going to be a real hallelujah session. Okay. So, shall I do this vertically or horizontally? Vertically. So, when you have an empty document, the first edit is necessarily an insertion of some kind. So that is 1, which creates version 1. The second edit, which we'll call 2, pardon me, creates version 2, and so on. Now, in many editors today, such as that in Gmail, you can backtrack and foretrack with Control-Z and Control-Y. But since many of these versions may be important to save as they are, we want to go sideways as well. So if now you perform the next edit operation we'll call 2A. How should I have the arrows here? I'll make a dotted line. Operation 2A now creates a version 2A. And you can still go on and create version 3 over here. But you can continue to branch sideways. And all of these are retrievable. And since you're dealing with edit decision lists, the portions are retrievable as well. So that, most important, you can show any two versions transclusively sideways. so you can see the parts which are the same between any two versions. Yeah?
What if the owner of a document moves it to somewhere else than you're pointing to?
Oh, that's just a practical question. I don't know. I mean, these are matters of compromise with the universe as distinct from true structure. Yeah.
Do you have any mechanism for saying I want to link to the most recent version of the document?
The mechanism would essentially, yeah, you just name the document with no version.
Right. But if you're trying to address a range within that document, you're doing it by character offsets.
No, you're not doing it by character offset. As I said, the content, the EDL doesn't have, well, you can count a character offset within a segment, but the EDL is essentially a concatenation of pieces without global addressing. So the EDL reconstitutes this reconstitutes the EDL of any particular version, and the transclusion mechanism shows it to you side by side.